So, when I started this sermon series way back, I guess a little after Christmas, because we're still kind of in this, what I call my larger sermon series on I am this kind of Christian. And then when I picked up that little bit on, when I got to the Jesus part of it and I started doing some digging and things like that, I realized I needed a little bit more than one sermon to talk about how can we express what we believe and how we think and how we live in Jesus. And so I came across those 7 little clever I am statements. And we started them at some point a little after Christmas. And I must confess, I didn't myself know the ways in which looking at these things that Jesus said would affect the way that I think of Jesus right now. Because, we actually just had a whole thing this morning on confession. And my confession is that, like everybody else, my own faith journey is still in flux. I'm still learning things about God and how it all works. And, occasionally I hope I'm a little further down the road than most people. But there are times when I encounter things in the Bible that I may have read 100 times before. And I have to go back and I reflect. And there are still things and ways that I am changed by digging a little bit deeper. These statements that Jesus says, I am the bread, I am the door, I am the light, I am the resurrection, I am the shepherd, I am the way and the truth and the life. These statements, as we've kind of went through each one, have forced even, and I consider myself a pretty unorthodox pastor, and most of you that have been journeying with us can say the same thing. I joke that if I had to go to a real church, that I would probably be kicked out a long time ago. Y'all can laugh at that, it's okay. I mean, it's the way I am. I feel like that if I had to go somewhere else, I would be in big trouble. Because when I look at these statements, they're really, if you think about these words, I am the bread, they're either made by somebody who is really wanting you to think deeply about who he is and what he's doing, or he's crazy. I mean, he's crazy. If I came in here and I told you people, I am a tree, you might start calling the funny farm on me because Marcus isn't a tree. But if I said something like, I am like a tree planted by the waters when I walk in the way of God, then with the context, you have a bit more understanding. But whenever I use this metaphorical statement or metaphors or things like that, it's forcing you to have to think about, well, what does Marcus mean by that statement? You see, when Jesus uses these words, these I am statement, they don't allow us to put Jesus in a nice, neat, little theological box that we can pass off to everyone that we meet. These metaphorical statements, they force us to always be wrestling with the question, what exactly does he mean by this? They resist certainty. And that's not a bad thing. We approach these words always with a little bit of humility. That while we can discuss them and preach on them and really try to think about all the ways that they apply to us, we can never fully contain all that there is within these statements in a simple sermon. This week we're going to kind of look back. We're going to look at the final statement that Jesus makes. It's found in the book of John. So, as a kid growing up, we had this rusty old grape arbor in our backyard. And I don't know if it was really even an arbor. It was some metal poles. And anyway, Dad planted some grapes out from underneath us when we moved back over to Damascus when I was about in 3rd grade. And And I just remember, it's funny whenever you go to prepare these sermons and you read these statements. I think Jesus does this intentionally. When he uses these words like bread or grapes or anything like that, or the vine, he calls up memories, ways in which maybe we engaged with whatever the thing is that he's talking about. And if you ever want to kind of peel back how sermon prep works, that's what I do. Is I'll read a passage, and then I fix a really good cup of tea, and I stare out my back window, and I think, what is this crazy Nazarene from 2,000 years ago talking about? And so for me, what I do is I go to the most logical object that I can kind of pull back up from my memory. And this is something I haven't thought about in a long time. But I remember that as these grapes aged, we would actually, we didn't grow a big garden or anything like that when I was a kid, but that was one of the things like you could eat in your backyard. They were so cool. Now these weren't like, you go to the supermarket and you get these really nice, grapes that you eat the whole thing on. And I don't know if these were like wine grapes or old wild grapes that we got or something like that. But if you've ever had them, and maybe you have, you once you eat them and when they're fully ripe, the skin is tough. And they got a seed in them. But the inside is really gooey. It's almost like a gum. They're actually really, really good. I miss them as an adult. I kind of think about that. And of course, what I did as a kid is I never ate the skin. You just pop it in your mouth. You'd chew all the stuff out. You'd spit the skin and the seed out, because it's cool to spit stuff when you're a kid. That's always the fun part of anything. That's why you eat watermelons. You can spit and not get in trouble. But those are the things that when I read this passage about Jesus saying, I am the true vine, my mind immediately went back to that old grape arbor in our backyard and eating those old grapes. And grapes really are one of the oldest domesticated food plants on the planet. Sometime around 8,000 BC, humans began to tame wild grapes to produce food. When archaeologists go excavating any ancient world site, the first thing they look for is the wine press. That kind of tells you the priorities of a village. They would have a little sacred place where they would worship their god and usually a wine press beside it. Just saying. Because that was one of the first things humans figured out, that yeast grew on the outside of them and what you could do with them. Now, the first recorded vineyard we have in the Bible is planted by Noah as soon as he gets off the boat. I mean, this man had spent 2 years on a boat, cooped up with all his family and a bunch of animals. Just saying. You may need a vineyard after that. Of course, it says he plants it and he makes some wine, and then he's the first recorded case of public intoxication, curses one of his kids, but that's a whole other story. That's our first recorded instance of it. Now, also in the Old Testament, when the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, they realized that not only was the land flowing with milk and honey, but it could support vineyards as well. Now, in prophetic language throughout the Old Testament, wine came to symbolize the coming kingdom of heaven and God's blessing. It is why Jesus' first miracle, recorded in John, involves turning water into wine, and his last statement, he uses it to refer to his blood being poured out for the forgiveness of sin. See, so grapes and their cultivation were commonly understood concepts. Along with all of when he's making these statements to his disciples, they understood all of the other spiritual ramifications, talking about how it applied to the coming of God's kingdom and all of that. So this statement that he makes is probably one of the most fitting ones that he can at the end of his time here on earth. I am the real vine, and my Father is the farmer. He cuts off every branch of me that does not bear grapes, and every branch that is grape-bearing he prunes back, so that it will bear even more. You're already pruned back by the message I have spoken. Live in me. Make your home in me, just as I do in you. In the same way that a branch can't bear grapes by itself, but only by being joined to the vine, you can't bear fruit unless you're joined with me. I am the vine. You are the branches. When you're joined with me, I am with you. The relation, intimate and organic. The harvest is sure to be abundant. Separated, you can't produce a thing. Anyone who separates from me is dead wood, gathered up and thrown on the bonfire. But if you make yourself at home with me and my words are at home in you, you can be sure that whatever you ask will be listened to and acted upon. This is how my Father shows who he is. When you produce grapes, when you mature as my disciples. Now, I must confess, I've confessed before. I do a lot of confessing. I'm an amateur gardener, and I want to emphasize this term amateur because I've already committed the cardinal sin this year of gardening. I decided, back around the first week of April when it got really warm, I decided, hey, it's the first week of April. I should go buy all my tomato plants, all my pepper plants. Now, my garden's not very big, so I'm out maybe like $10 on the whole deal. But I went ahead and bought them because I was like, I'm going to get those things out. I'd like to have some tomatoes by the 1st of June. I don't garden much, but we like some fresh fruit. Well, you know where I am right now. It's all dead. It's all gone. I planted a little too early, and thus I'll have to go back and get some more. There you go. So I'm not the greatest at gardening. I like to pretend. I consider it a good theological exercise. That's what gardening is for me. It harkens back to that whole passage where, God stuck Adam out of the garden and said, by the sweat of your brow you shall eat. I just thank goodness that that I don't eat by the sweat of my own brow today, or we would eat chicken eggs. That's about all I can grow at this point. So, but I've also always been fascinated by grapes. And I've always thought, I would be fun to, own a vineyard or something random like that. I don't know why. I guess it goes back to when I was a kid. It was the one thing that we could eat in our backyard. And so, and throughout my adult life, I've always tried to grow them. Every few years, I'll just get this kind of like, well, I'm going to try to grow some backyard grapes this year. And it never fails. I have trouble really keeping them alive. But this year, I decided since I need them for a sermon illustration, I'm going to start again. So we'll see I'll let y'all know how this whole thing plays out. Jesus says, I am the true vine. Now keep in mind, like I said, this is something that these people would be very, very familiar with. And actually for the illustration, what I wish I could have done was like dig up a fully mature grapevine and bring it in here. But I really couldn't do that because I didn't know anybody that would have one and let me dig it up, and then it would make a mess. So I went to my friendly neighborhood hardware store and bought one. But you have to buy 3 at a time, so that's why I put them all up here. So these... This statement that he makes, it's a very curious little statement. I am the true vine. You see, he knows that this is it for him. This is the end. This is where things are fixing to happen. He's fixing to face his crucifixion. So in the discourse from last week, when we talked about where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he attempts to bring comfort to his disciples. And he says, things like, if they're, in my house, in my Father's house are many rooms. I'm going to prepare a place for you. After he'd already told them that they were all fixing to abandon him. So in this passage, I think he's trying to encourage them to hold on to a faith that is about to be really, really tested. I am the real vine. Now the vine, or the stem as we would call it, is the lifeline for a grape plant. Through the vine travels all the nourishment the branches need to make fruit. Without a connection that ties the branches to the ground, then everything dies. It's the unifying force of everything. It is the common thing that connects all the parts. Without it, there is no fruit. And so when we look at these lovely little plants, I tried to pick some with a few branches, but they didn't. So the vine is this little woody part right here. That's what that is. There's one little branch on this one. So the thing is about branches, especially about us as spiritual branches, we often graft ourselves onto imitation vines. Things like money, success, power, and even seemingly noble things like family. We try to draw spiritual nourishment from these things. But here's the thing, they're not grounded in the real deep reality of God. And when we graft ourselves onto them, we're never able to bear the fruit that we need to. And we live this kind of half-life. Separated from the true vine, Jesus, we put ourselves in danger. And as even Jesus warns in this, without being productive, we risk ourselves of being cut off. See, here Jesus says, I am the vine, the one true vine, the only one. It's another one of those uncomfortable, exclusive statements like we had last week. But like last week, we have to remind ourselves that sometimes we confuse ourselves for the vine. I am not the vine. I am the branch. It's not my place to question who is in and who is out, who Jesus is willing to call. I do not criticize what another branch looks like. Rather, I must focus myself on staying connected to the vine. And this is how we produce that good fruit in our lives. A branch cannot grow without a vine. It can't produce anything on its own. But what is it we are supposed to produce? Grapes! That's easy, right? Be easy if it was just literal. It's got to grow grapes. What is this fruit that we are supposed to make with our lives? Now, what I can already see, some of you don't, but some of you are like me. You worry about performance. You are people who need to live by checklists. And you want to scream at Jesus, why are you using all these metaphors? Just tell us what you want us to do already. I have 5 exclamation points after that, because that's the way I am. Just tell me, Jesus. Quit with the grapes and the vine and the branches. Just give me a list. Tell me what I need to do. I need a list so that I can do what I need to do so I can get on to the next task. Because I am one of those people that make lists, and there is no greater pleasure in my life than knocking things off of a written list. I mean, I love it. It's right up there like it's an adrenaline rush. It's a high. I make a list, check stuff off. I love it. It's the way I live. After all, that's how Christianity works, right? Right, we have a checklist. Get saved, check. Get baptized, check. Show up to church, check. Pay my tithe, double check. Volunteer to do something in the church so the pastor will stop guilt-tripping me, check. So once I do all this stuff, I have all the fruit, right? Isn't the fruit of the church a full volunteer roster, a full sanctuary, all the bills paid, and a few baptisms a year? Isn't that how we define it? Isn't that how it's supposed to work? But the kingdom of heaven and Jesus, they don't work that way. Life in Him isn't a checklist that we tick off the boxes as we go on with our life. Rather, remaining and abiding in Him. Part of the great thing, I guess, about buying these lovely, small, little grape plants is that they are a great illustration in the fact that this thing that we have, this relationship with Jesus and this kingdom of heaven thing, it's a growing thing. It's not about making a checklist and reaching some sort of level of growth of church, but it begins small and it starts here. And then over time, it's always growing and it's always changing. It's dynamic. Abiding, that's a great word that we didn't pull from the King James, but I like that word. Abiding in Jesus means that it's more about a process than it is a destination. It's more about a way of doing everything in our life than necessarily making the checklist and then getting the good grade. Which I must confess absolutely infuriates type A personalities like myself. Makes me angry. It's hard to deal with. And yet I know that any time I reduce down this life in Jesus to some sort of measurable, quantifiable data set, I lose something. It's like trying to define marriage or parenthood down to a list of do's and don'ts. While it's certainly helpful to have guiding principles and guiding statements, things you should do to be a good spouse or a good parent, those things in and of themselves don't make a marriage or a parent-child relationship. There has to be something behind all of those acts that guide the way. I loved you the way my Father has loved you. Make yourself at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done. Kept the Father's commands and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy, and your joy wholly mature. This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. This is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. You are my friends when you do the things I command you. I'm no longer calling you servants because servants don't understand what their master is thinking and planning. No, I've named you friends because I've let you in on everything I've heard from the Father. You didn't choose me. Remember, I chose you and put you in the world to bear fruit, fruit that won't spoil. As fruit bearers, whatever you ask the Father in relation to me, he gives you. But remember the root command, love one another. The root that the vine, Jesus, draws from is love. The fruit that grows through our lives is love. The gospel is about love. Not this disembodied spiritual concept, but one that was very earthy, one that was lived and continues to be lived out in the person of Jesus. It has flesh and it has bone and it makes hard choices and says stuff like, lay down your lives for each other. I mean, who wants to hear that? Not me. But I laid down my life for you, so you do that as well. Even after he's gone, he says, stay rooted in this sacrificial, giving love of God. You know what I find funny is that we're the ones that bear the fruit. Jesus is just the vehicle. He's not the one out in the world now showing this fruit of love. It's our job. That's why we tie into his vine. He feeds us so that we bear the love of God into the world around us. Bear this fruit of love because at the end of it all, when this age of the empire of man is at its end, and this kingdom of heaven that we talk about and that we try to live in as best we can right now completely emerges, the only thing that will count for anything is that abiding life of love in Jesus. Dear Heavenly Father, I love you so much, and I thank you for this day, and my prayer is that you would be with us as we kind of wrap up this little section of our look, and when we speak of you and speak of how you work in us, God, that we don't necessarily put it down to checklist statements, but we wrestle with these kind of things about what does it mean that you are the bread, and what does it mean that you are the light, and what does it mean that you are the vine, and what does it mean for us to live attached to that vine. And help us, God, as we go about our life and stay rooted in that command. And may we be able to show that to a world that I think that desperately needs to see real, true, lived out, sacrificial love. Amen. Please stand.